the U.S., they're not some third party. They are directly involved in this conflict, and they are on the losing side of this conflict. Donald Trump, let's be frank, he doesn't like Zelensky, right? He hates the Kiev regime in Ukraine. He views them as being in league with his political opponents in the United States. He does not believe, according to his heretical perception of America's national interest, foreign policy, grand strategy, he does not believe that Ukraine is essential to U.S. national interests, unlike the previous administration and most of the blob. Why? Because he doesn't believe in the pursuit of global hegemony and primacy. And this is coming from the American president to the Russian president over a conflict that the U.S., they're not some third party. They are directly involved in this conflict, and they are on the losing side of this conflict. And Russia's position is, we hoped that you would show some reason. It doesn't look like you're doing that so far. We'll just continue, right? Russia's been clear. No ceasefire. We're not giving time to the Kiev regime again for you to rearm and retrain it and refortify it. That was the Minsk Accords 1 and 2. We've already been there, right? That was the Istanbul communique. We've been fooled too many times. We don't trust you. There will be no ceasefire before a complete political settlement. We can, if you want to talk, we'll talk. But as we talk, Russian forces will continue to grind their way to victory on the battlefield. And there's nothing that you can do to stop it. You do not dictate terms to us. We're winning, and we're going to achieve a victory on the battlefield or diplomatically. We dictate the terms. If you don't accept our terms, and they've been presented again and again, multiple times, if you don't accept those, then we'll just keep doing what we're doing. That's it. And that's, as far as, the Russian government is concerned, that's the way, they can hope, can always hope that reason will suddenly appear. But ultimately, Donald Trump, let's be frank, he doesn't like Zelensky, right? He hates the Kiev regime in Ukraine. He views them as being in league with his political opponents in the United States for all types of, political interference, impeachment attempts, everything against him, interfering in U.S. elections, supporting his Democratic opponents, right? And which is all true, right? I mean, there's really no question there. Right. But, certain countries are allowed to interfere in U.S. politics. Right. It's, Israel, first and foremost, right. With
APEC.
Yes. APEC, the most powerful lobby in history. If you haven't read Mearsheimer's and Waltz's book on the lobby, the Israeli lobby, you really need to, and the pernicious effect it has on U.S. foreign policy, but also the United Kingdom and, of course, Ukraine, right? Maybe to a lesser extent, Saudi Arabia, less so than before. So he doesn't like Zelensky. He doesn't like the Kiev regime. He does not believe, according to his heretical perception of America's national interest, foreign policy, grand strategy. He does not believe that Ukraine is essential to U.S. national interests, unlike the previous administration and most of the blob. Why? Because he doesn't believe in the pursuit of global hegemony and primacy. Right? Which is not to say that he's a good guy, right? He doesn't believe in multipolarity and everything, but he thinks the way that the U.S. has been pursuing hegemony and primacy is ultimately ridiculously expensive, right, for the U.S. with very little benefits. And there's a very good argument to make for that, right? How much it has cost America and the American taxpayer. And from what we've seen with his declarations about Greenland and Canada and the Panama Canal and Mexico and the renaming the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, it seems like his alternative vision Well, it's not any better. It seems like it's old school imperialism, right? You want to call the Monroe Doctrine domination of the Western Hemisphere. We can call his new iteration maybe the Donroe Doctrine, right? But again, it's not to say that it's any better, but it's very different from the blob, the U.S. deep state, the permanent bureaucracy, whatever you want to call it, conception of the importance of Ukraine. He wants to focus on other things. That's perfectly clear. He wants to focus on his own war against the deep state in the United States. He wants to focus on the U.S. borders, on Mexico, probably also with China and the Middle East. He has already long declared that he wants to restore an economic war of sanctions against Iran, maximum pressure, right? Because, if it didn't work the first time, I guess, try again, double down, whatever. But he wants to dump the Ukraine conflict. But he's the U.S. president. And ultimately, as soon as he took office, he owned that conflict. And now he's left with the position that he's got this war that he doesn't really want. But how do you walk away from it? He can't just turn Ukraine over to Putin's tender mercies. He will be proclaimed a traitor, the president who handed Ukraine on a silver platter to Vladimir Putin, right? Satan incarnate, the evil emperor, the dark Satan, whatever, the U.S. propaganda wants to pick them as, this week. And if Russia is not interested in any deal that he has the capability of offering and accepting, then all of his people, all of these neocons like Mark Rubio and Mike Waltz and others are already around him. It's on the pages of the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. You need to escalate to de-escalate. If you want peace, you have to show strength. And of course, that threatens to put him back into this very same losing game that Biden has been playing for the last 3 years, because ultimately they picked a fight with Russia in Russia's own backyard that they can't win. Mm-hmm. It's a bad situation for him. And we might hope, right? I personally, I don't do hope. Journalists, normal people, okay, hope, yeah, that's fine. But for an analyst, hope is, shall we say, it interferes with objectivity. So we can hope that Donald Trump will just say, screw this, and walk away from Ukraine, right? Say, I've got other more important things. I gave it a try. That neither side wants peace. I'm done. But he's the U.S. president, and I don't believe he can do that. And no one, I think seriously, John Mearsheimer, the foremost realist scholar, living international relations scholar, and maybe the foremost realist of all time, right? Certainly he's in the running for that. He believes the same thing. He believes there's no deal that can be made, and ultimately this will be settled on the battlefield and on Russia's terms, which it seems the most likely outcome. Unfortunately, right? We would all prefer, for the number of Ukrainians and Russians and whoever else will die in this conflict, and always the potential for it to escalate horizontally out of the country to, surrounding countries and involve some type of direct conflict between Russia and NATO. No one wants that, right? But if Russia's winning, and if they can't come to terms with that in Kiev, in Washington, D.C., in Brussels or London or anywhere else, if they're still in denial about that, then this war will continue on to its inevitable end, no matter how hard and grinding and bloody it is to get there. But we've talked multiple times already. I've been talking about this conflict from the beginning. I said it was going to be a long, hard, I called it a forever war. And I believe that ultimately it will be. I don't think we'll ever see real peace in Ukraine again, whether it's a frozen conflict for time or a guerrilla war or something. I think Ukraine is the proverbial Humpty Dumpty on the wall. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses, all the hegemon's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That's Ukraine. And I say that, with a great deal of pain, because my own wife is from Crimea, which, used to be part of Ukraine. And we also have family in the Donbass and Kharkov and Odessa all across Ukraine. So I'm well familiar with all the agonies of this country and what it's going through, both internally since 2014 and honestly well before that, but particularly with Russia's unfortunately very necessary intervention in 2022, and 3 years later, here we are. And however much we might hope otherwise, I don't think that Donald Trump is going to bring peace to Ukraine. Not in 24 hours, not in 100 days, and not in 6 months. Probably not at all. Not on his terms anyway. Not by his deal. If he's ready to accept Putin's deal, right, then there's something to talk about. And again, the Russian government will talk with him. Putin will meet with him. Dialogue is always good, even if they can't come to an agreement. They are, two of the indispensable countries in the world in terms of geopolitics, right? The U.S., a fading superpower. Russia, a restored great power, right? In nuclear terms, at least a superpower, but maybe not in terms of some other terms. But there's plenty of other crises going around the world that these two countries should be able to deal with each other. And they're not even talking to each other at this point, right? So if we can agree to disagree on Ukraine, maybe there's one or two other things around the world that we can actually come to some kind of modus vivendi on. One would hope. But that unfortunately, I don't think Trump is going to be able to do what he believed he was going to be able to do and talked about on the campaign, because inevitably he's still the U.S. president. We have to get over this belief that if the Americans simply elect Coke instead of Pepsi, if they simply elect one guy instead of the other, that everything will be better, everything will be okay, right? And the problems of the world will be solved. No. He's still the American president, right? The America doesn't go away, and it only changes so much. Really, it's only a very slight amount from presidency to presidency. So maybe not a lot of hope, for an immediate end to this conflict. But maybe we can hope that Donald Trump doesn't escalate. That maybe he can restrain something that Biden or Kamala Harris might have very well done, leading us to a World War III. Maybe that's the best that we can realistically hope for.
Okay. I want to get your comments. So now that you have given this explanation, what the feeling I'm getting is that Donald Trump's inevitable meeting with Putin might turn out to be one like the one he had with Kim Jong Un, where it didn't produce any tangible results. And also, I want to get your comment on this very interesting comments that Zelensky made the past few days, where he said that Ukraine was misled about its NATO ambitions by the US, and now it looks like they will not join NATO forever. Why did Ukraine believe the US when it knew that the US would throw countries under the bus when they were deemed to be geopolitically inconvenient for them?
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, I think the comparison of a potential negotiations or at least discussions between Trump and Putin, comparing that to Trump and Kim Jong Un during Trump's first administration is very interesting, because after initial bluster and name calling, childish name calling, Trump calling Kim Jong Un Rocket Man, and sending nuclear submarines armed with Tomahawk nuclear cruise missiles patrolling off North Korea's waters very openly and demonstrably and everything. Of course, Donald Trump actually met with Kim Jong Un, and there was, briefly, you might call it a diplomatic bromance, and there was a great deal of outrage from the not just the US, but the entirety of the Western foreign policy establishment, the blob, as Ben Rhodes called it, right? That the US president met with the North Korean leader. That's heresy, right? That's good meeting with evil in their Manichaean terms, the way they look at the world. That should never happen. That is a gift to Kim Jong Un, because the West doesn't do diplomacy anymore, right? Diplomacy is a gift that they give to a country that has met, that has bandwagon with them or is acceding to their demands, right? You don't do diplomacy with those that you consider adversaries, right? That's the twisted way. And this is a result of the belief, this type of U.S. and largely, in Europe, a more European exceptionalism. Their belief that they are systemically, socially, and morally superior to every other country or type of government on the earth, and therefore they shouldn't do diplomacy. That is in effect coming to some type of accommodation or appeasement with evil, right? That's in the black and white, idiot's guide, the way they look at the world. So they don't do diplomacy, which I don't know. I mean, I read Bismarck in university, and I would like to think that people who study international relations and diplomacy and might have, studied from the great diplomats of history over, what diplomacy actually is, but they have a different idea. But ultimately, any hopes for some type of North Korean, South Korean, or North Korean U.S. détente were ruined by the people within Trump's own administration. And this has been openly admitted. John Bolton, he's been quite perfectly clear and gloating in his memoirs about how he and the rest of the U.S. Blob, the foreign policy and security establishment, just adopted a policy of doing everything they could to misinform and manipulate and control the U.S. president, Trump. They're quite obvious about that. And he took personal credit for sinking any idea of whatever Trump had with North Korea, with Kim Jong Un. So
his security detail has been revoked.
Absolutely. And here, we have the potential for all of that again. The U.S. Secretary of State is one of the biggest political neocons, Mark Rubio, right? I mean, Mike Waltz is his national security advisor. We haven't seen every appointment yet, right? Actually be passed through the Senate, but we've seen enough of it so far. He brought in a bunch of neocons. He hopes that they are neocons that are more loyal to him than to the blob. But still, quite obviously, he's getting bad advice and not so much misinformation as disinformation, like the Russian economy is failing, or Russia has lost 1 million people, or Russia helped the U.S. win World War II a bit. This fatal errors in understanding, not just history, but numbers and reality today. If he is being fed such incorrect information about what's going on in Ukraine, and with Russia as a whole, then how can we expect him to achieve, to arrive at correct decisions when he's operating basically, essentially, on the US's own propaganda? Because that's what it is. This is this incestuous negative feedback loop of propaganda and media and decision making going back and forth and back and forth. And it's not just with Russia, right? This is the way that these experts, right, within the U.S. government, within U.S. academia, you see it very well yourself by reading what these U.S. experts, right, in government and out of, say about India, right? You know how much of it, what a completely distorted view of India, the Indian economy. And it's the same with China. And it's the same, if not more so, of course, because of the vitriol involved with Russia. And that's a problem. It is a huge problem when you have to deal with the United States, because they're not operating from the real world. They're operating from the world that they want the world to be. That's a problem. It's a really hard to achieve diplomacy in, confrontational situations over that.
And I want to get your thoughts about Zelensky's comments about how Ukraine was misled about its NATO membership.
I mean, I don't know what to say. He's an idiot then. I mean, first of all, it has always been the place that multiple European countries, have said no. There was never any question. There are some NATO countries, right? The Baltics, Poland, others, the United Kingdom, that were very clear from the beginning that, yes, they wanted Ukraine in NATO. And they wanted it yesterday. And yes, please give me World War III. I mean, they were perfectly willing to go there. Other countries like Hungary, Slovakia under Fico, but even Germany, all along have said no. That's not going to happen. And if they wanted to buy into, whatever misleading statements the U.S. made, you pointed out, no matter how many countries and peoples that the U.S. has exploited around the world and used as their proxies, whether we're talking the Kurds in Iraq, the Kurds in Syria, the Afghan government that they created in Afghanistan, how many times, they will use and abuse and then ultimately throw them under the bus, as you called it, when there is a decision made that it's no longer beneficial for them. There's still never any end to gullible proxies around the world. And one of my case in points is Taiwan, right? And no offense, but there are enough people in the Indian government who would be all too willing to serve as U.S. proxies against China, right? Now, thankfully, Modi has kind of, in my impression, he's walked back a bit from this whole disastrous Quad and so forth attempts to rope India into that position. But there, very well that there are plenty of people in Indian politics who, if the U.S. said jump, they'd only say how high, right? Jump into the fire, jump into, a war with China, they'd be glad to. And I think ultimately, first of all, there's two potential reasons, and ultimately, I think they usually have a degree of coinciding. One is ideological, right? One is they really believe, right, that the U.S. is the shining city on the hill, or the West in general is, and that the whole world would be better off run from Washington D.C. and secondarily from Brussels, I guess. And the other one is simply because there's so much money out there in adopting these positions that, it becomes very hard for people to stay on a career path that says something to the opposite. And I'm sure you find that yourself. I know from my experiences with Indian media, which I refuse to go on Indian media again after the experiences I had in 2022 on multiple Indian media. The English speaking Indian media is by and large incredibly pro-Western to a degree where they simply echo US talking points and Western propaganda, right? And then all you have to do is look back and see how many times India just repeated all the nonsense about this conflict for the last 3 years and have been proven wrong and wrong and wrong in their assessment of it time and time again. So that smarmy, British persona that many Indian anchors and commentators in English have, and attempting, to level that smarminess and condescension on Russians. I don't have a very favorable image of that, but I'm sure you experience and how difficult when you don't share that view of the world. What is your career path? How do you have success in media or academia or, God forbid, something like think tanks or something like that, when all the money is in saying, sticking with the Washington line? So that in that way, belief and money have a oddly coincidental way of coinciding. And that's part of the soft/smart power of U.S. hegemony. Right, of it is, right? They get people within your own countries to adopt your views, which is why control of a country's information space is at least as important, if not more so, than military space. And increasingly, militaries are recognizing, including the U.S. military, that the information space is just another part of the military battlefield. And if as a country, you don't achieve control of your information space such that you can stop these pernicious amounts of undue money and influence and so forth to affect your politics, then you'll end up like Ukraine did, right? After the U.S. spent billions of dollars in that. Georgia is a country that just recently, after having suffered through the Rose Revolution of Mikhail Saakashvili back in the early 2000s, has stood up to a full-on regime change, new color revolution attempt by the West, and achieved a modicum of control over their own information space. Georgia had more NGOs, Western-funded NGOs per capita than any other country in the world. Small little Georgia, right? A toxic influence, but a kind of antibody evolved, within Georgia's own politics that protect them, which doesn't mean that they don't want to be friends with the West, right? That they don't want to do business, but they also want to do business with Russia, even if they don't see them as a friend. And they certainly don't want to serve as proxies or cannon fodder for a second front against Russia, right? That's simple pragmatism, right? And of course, the U.S. doesn't see things that way. So I hope that all countries out there, be it or peoples, right? Taiwan, of course, is part of China, and no matter what some people might want to believe otherwise. But I hope that all of these people out there, be they the Kurds in Syria or the Taiwanese or those Indians who have been seduced by the siren call of the West, really need to take a look at what's happening in Ukraine and so many other places, and have a cold shower, have an awakening, however rude that awakening is.